December 3rd, 1887, 10:42 p.m. Cole Mackenzie's hand trembled as his fingers wrapped around the ivory handle of his Colt 45. $20,000 in gold. That was the bounty the Carson brothers had placed on Kris Kristofferson's head. And Cole, the man who'd ridden beside Kris for 7 years through hell and high water, the man Kris called brother, had taken the contract. The plan was brutally simple. Walk into the Silver Dollar Saloon, wait until Kris was distracted at the poker table. One bullet through the heart. Ride out into the Wyoming winter and disappear forever. Cole pushed through the saloon doors. The piano player was hammering out a melody. Cigar smoke hung thick in the air. And there, at the corner table with his back to the entrance, sat Kris Kristofferson, studying his cards like they held the secrets of the universe. Cole's boots echoed on the wooden floor. He drew his weapon, steadied his aim at Kris's broad back, and squeezed the trigger. Click. Nothing. Not even a spark. The piano stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward Cole standing there with a useless weapon in his shaking hand. Kris didn't even turn around. He just laid down his cards, a full house naturally, and spoke 5 words that would echo through the territories for generations. I've been counting on you. What nobody in that room knew, what the history books won't tell you, is that Kris Kristofferson had known about the hit for 4 weeks. And what he did in those 4 weeks didn't just save his life. It rewrote the rules of survival in the Wyoming territory. The man called Kris. To understand what happened that December night, you need to understand who Kris Kristofferson was in 1887. He wasn't just another gunslinger or outlaw. He was something different. A former Union cavalry officer turned frontier lawman who refused to bow to the railroad barons and cattle kings who thought they owned the West. Kris had been appointed marshal of Sweetwater County 3 years prior, and in those 3 years, he'd done something remarkable. He'd cleaned up a territory that most people considered beyond saving. He'd driven out the worst of the claim jumpers, stood up to the big ranchers who treated homesteaders like vermin, and made it possible for ordinary people to build lives without living in fear. But there was a problem. A big problem named Marcus Carson. Marcus Carson and his 2 brothers, Nathaniel and James, controlled the Carson Cattle Company. They owned 400,000 acres of Wyoming rangeland. And they wanted more. They wanted every acre, every water source, every scrap of land that could turn a profit. And standing in their way was one stubborn, gray-eyed marshal who refused to look the other way when their hired guns burned out homesteaders or diverted water from public streams. The Carsons had tried everything. They'd sent their best shootists. Kris had outdrawn them or outsmarted them. They'd tried bribing county officials. Kris had better relationships with the territorial governor. They'd tried framing him for crimes. Kris had alibis that held up in court. By December 1887, the Carson brothers were desperate. And desperate men don't just make dangerous decisions, they make cruel ones. The meeting Marcus Carson called his brothers together in their ranch house outside Cheyenne. It was the kind of place that looked like a fortress, high walls, armed guards, everything built to project power. "We've tried legal means," Marcus said, pouring himself 3 fingers of Kentucky bourbon. "We've tried force. Nothing works. Kristofferson is like a ghost. Every time we move against him, he's already prepared." Nathaniel Carson, the youngest and meanest of the 3, slammed his fist on the table. "So what are you suggesting? We just let him keep interfering with our business? Let him protect every dirt farmer and 2-bit prospector who squats on land we need?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus said quietly, "that we find the one person Kristofferson trusts completely, and we turn them." James Carson, the middle brother and the smartest of the 3, leaned back in his chair. "You're talking about Cole Mackenzie." "I am." "That's dangerous, Marcus. Mackenzie's been Kris's deputy for 7 years. He's loyal." "Every man has a price," Marcus replied. "We just need to find his." Cole Mackenzie's burden. Cole Mackenzie had ridden with Kris Kristofferson since 1880. He'd been a drifter back then, running from a past he didn't like to discuss. Kris had given him a badge, a purpose, and something he'd never had before, a sense of belonging. They'd been through range wars together. They'd faced down the hole-in-the-wall gang. They'd survived ambushes, blizzards, and situations where most men would have broken. Cole would have died for Kris. He'd said so 100 times. But in November 1887, Cole's world collapsed. His younger brother Thomas had been working a silver claim near South Pass City. It was a decent claim, nothing spectacular, but enough to feed Thomas's wife and 3 kids. Then Marcus Carson's surveyors showed up with a deed that said the land belonged to the Carson Cattle Company. They gave Thomas 3 days to clear out. Thomas refused. It was his legal claim, filed properly with the Territorial Land Office. On the 4th day, Carson's men came back. They didn't negotiate. They burned Thomas's cabin to the ground. Thomas tried to fight back. They shot him dead in front of his family. Cole had to bury his brother in the frozen ground while Thomas's widow and children sobbed in the December wind. The county sheriff, a man in Carson's pocket, ruled it justifiable homicide, defense of property. Kris had tried to help. He'd filed charges with the territorial court, pushed for a federal investigation. But the wheels of justice turned slowly, and Carson's lawyers were the best money could buy. The case would take years, if it ever went anywhere at all. Cole's sister-in-law, Margaret, had no money. Thomas's life insurance, what little there was, would barely last 2 months. The kids needed food, shelter, and a future that seemed impossible now. Cole was drowning in grief and rage, and he didn't see the trap until it had already closed around him. The approached November 9, 1887, 3 weeks before the shooting. Cole was outside the marshal's office, checking on his horse, when a polished carriage pulled up. The door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. "Deputy Mackenzie, my name is Harold Sutton. I represent certain business interests in Cheyenne. Might I have a word?" Cole's instincts screamed danger. "I don't talk to Carson's lawyers." "I'm not a lawyer," Sutton said smoothly. "I'm more of a problem solver, and I believe you and I share a common problem. I've got nothing to say to you." Sutton pulled out an envelope. "Not even if I can offer you something that would change your sister-in-law's circumstances, something that would ensure Thomas's children never go hungry again." Cole's hand moved toward his gun, but Sutton held up his empty hands. "No tricks, Deputy. Just an opportunity. 5 minutes of your time. If you're not interested, I'll drive away and we'll never speak again." Cole knew he should walk away. Every fiber of his being told him this was wrong. But the image of his nieces and nephew crying at their father's grave haunted him. He nodded. They walked to the edge of town, out of earshot. Sutton didn't waste time. "The Carson brothers respect you, Deputy. They know you're a man of integrity, but they also know you've suffered a terrible loss, one they regret." "Regret?" Cole's voice was cold. "They murdered my brother. A misunderstanding that escalated tragically, but what's done is done. The question is, what happens now? Margaret and those children, they need help, real help." Sutton pulled out a bank draft, $20,000, enough to buy a house in Denver, enough to put those kids through school, enough to ensure they never want for anything. "In exchange for what?" Sutton's voice dropped. "Marshal Kristofferson has been a thorn in the Carson brothers' side for too long. They want him removed, permanently, and they believe you're the only man who could get close enough." Cole felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "You want me to kill Kris. I want you to make a choice between your loyalty to one man and your loyalty to your family. The Carsons aren't unreasonable. 1 bullet, 1 moment. December 3rd at the Silver Dollar. Kristofferson plays poker there every Saturday night. You walk in, you take your shot, you walk out. We'll have a wagon waiting to take you and Margaret's family to California. New names, new lives. And if I refuse?" Sutton's expression hardened. "Then those children grow up in poverty. Margaret loses the house, and eventually, when you've been worn down by the guilt of watching them suffer, you'll wish you'd taken this offer. Or worse, the Carsons will find another way to deal with Kristofferson, and you'll live knowing you could have at least profited from the inevitable." Cole stood there, the weight of the bank draft in his hand, feeling like an anchor pulling him under. "Get out of here!" "Think about it," Sutton said, climbing back into his carriage. "I'll be at the Grand Hotel until the end of the month. When you're ready to do right by your family, you know where to find me." The Watcher, what Cole didn't know, what Sutton didn't know, was that Kris Kristofferson had already heard about the approach. Kris hadn't become Marshal of Sweetwater County by being naive. He'd learned long ago that in the West, information was more valuable than gold. He had informants everywhere: ranch hands, hotel clerks, telegraph operators, people the wealthy and powerful never bothered to notice. One of those people was a stable boy named Miguel, who worked at the Grand Hotel. Miguel had been mucking out stalls when Sutton and Marcus Carson met in Carson's suite to discuss the Mackenzie solution. Miguel couldn't hear everything through the floorboards, but he heard enough. 20,000. Deputy Mackenzie. December 3rd. Silver dollar. That afternoon, Miguel rode out to Chris's small ranch house outside town. Kris was chopping wood when Miguel arrived, and the boy was nervous, talking fast. "Slow down," Kris said, setting down his axe. "Start from the beginning." Miguel told him everything he'd heard. When he finished, Kris was quiet for a long time, staring at the mountains in the distance. "You did the right thing coming to me," Kris finally said. He pulled out a gold eagle coin and pressed it into Miguel's hand. "But Miguel, you can't tell anyone about this. Not your family, not your friends. This conversation never happened. Understand?" "Yes, sir, Marshal." After Miguel left, Kris sat on his porch for 3 hours, watching the sun set over the mountains. Cole had been his right hand for 7 years. They'd saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Kris had been there when Cole's brother died. He'd seen the pain in Cole's eyes at the funeral. Most men in Chris's position would have acted immediately. Arrest Cole on conspiracy charges, or worse, eliminate the threat before it became deadly. But Kris Kristofferson wasn't most men. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People weren't simply good or evil. They were complicated, driven by love and fear and desperation. Cole was a good man facing an impossible choice, and that meant there was still a chance to save him. Not from the Carsons, but from himself. Kris made a decision that night. He wouldn't confront Cole. He wouldn't even let on that he knew. Instead, he'd set a trap, not for Cole, but for the men who'd tried to turn him. The gunsmith Kris rode to Laramie the next morning, to a small shop tucked between a hardware store and a boarding house. The sign outside read, "Jensen's Firearms and Repair." Otto Jensen was a Norwegian immigrant who'd been a master gunsmith in the old country. He owed Kris a favor. Kris had once prevented a lynch mob from hanging Otto's son over a misunderstanding involving a stolen horse. "Marshal Kristofferson," Otto said, his accent still thick after 20 years in America. "What brings you to Laramie?" "I need something unusual, Otto. I need you to make me a gun that doesn't work." Otto's bushy eyebrows rose. "A gun that doesn't work?" "Not exactly. I need a Colt 45 that looks perfect, feels perfect, has the right weight, but when you pull the trigger, nothing happens. No bullet, no firing, just a click." Otto stroked his beard. "You want the firing pin removed?" "More than that. I want it to look like a working gun in every way. If someone inspected it closely, they'd have to disassemble it completely to realize it's been modified." "Can you do it?" "Yeah, I can do this." "But Marshal, why would you want such a thing?" "Let's just say I need to teach someone a lesson about trust." Otto worked for 2 days. When he was finished, he handed Kris a Colt 45 that was identical to the standard issue weapon every deputy in Wyoming carried. "The firing pin is filed down to nothing," Otto explained. "The hammer strikes, but there's no force to ignite the primer. To anyone who doesn't know, it's a perfect weapon." Kris paid Otto double his usual rate. "This conversation stays between us. Always, Marshal. Always." The switch now came the delicate part. Kris needed to swap Cole's service weapon with Otto's dummy gun without Cole noticing. On November 28, 5 days before the planned shooting, Kris sent Cole on an errand. "I need you to ride down to Rock Spring. There's a witness in the Brennan robbery case who's willing to testify, but he's nervous. Bring him back here where we can protect him." The round trip would take Cole at least 10 hours, more than enough time. While Cole was gone, Kris and his most trusted friend, former Pinkerton agent named Sarah Blackwood, let themselves into Cole's boarding house room. Sarah had skills most people wouldn't expect from a woman in the 1880s. She could pick locks, track suspects, and shoot as straight as any man Kris had ever known. They found Cole's gun in the same place it always was, in a holster hanging on the bedpost. "This feels wrong," Sarah said quietly as Kris made the switch. "Would you rather I put a bullet in him myself?" Kris asked. "This way, nobody dies. Cole learns his lesson. And the Carsons learned that I'm always 3 steps ahead. And if it doesn't work, Cole realizes the gun's been tampered with, then we'll deal with it." "But Cole's not a killer, Sarah. He's a good man in a bad situation. When he pulls that trigger and nothing happens, he'll understand what he almost became." They left everything else exactly as they'd found it. When Cole returned that evening with the witness, he never suspected a thing. The waiting game. The next few days were the longest of Chris's life. He had to act normal around Cole, had to pretend nothing was wrong. They patrolled together, ate meals together, played cards at the office while winter storms rattled the windows. Kris watched Cole carefully. He saw the way Cole's hands sometimes shook. He saw the dark circles under his eyes. He saw a man wrestling with his conscience, losing sleep, aging years in days. Part of Kris wanted to just tell Cole the truth, that he knew about the offer, that he'd already made arrangements to help Margaret and the kid, that Cole didn't have to carry this burden alone. But Kris understood something crucial. Cole needed to make his choice. He needed to stand at that crossroads and decide who he was. Because if Kris intervened now, Cole would never truly face what he'd been willing to do. Guilt would eat him alive for the rest of his life. This way, when Cole pulled that trigger and heard the click instead of the bang, he'd face his betrayal head on. And in that moment of stark clarity, he'd either become the man he was meant to be, or the man the Carsons wanted him to be. On December 2nd, The day before the planned shooting, Cole knocked on Kris's door late at night. "Can't sleep?" Kris asked, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "Thinking about Thomas," Cole said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "Can't stop seeing his face when they shot him." "I'm still working the federal case," Kris said. "It's slow, but we'll get justice for him." "Justice," Cole repeated bitterly. "Sometimes I wonder if justice is just a word powerful people use to keep the rest of us in line." Kris studied his deputy. "You don't believe that, don't I?" Cole downed his whiskey in one gulp. "The Carsons killed my brother, and they're sleeping peacefully in their mansion. Where's the justice in that?" "Justice isn't always fast, Cole. But it's real. You've seen it. We've delivered it together, you and me, for 7 years. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. "I should get some sleep. Tomorrow's Saturday. Poker night at the Silver Dollar." "I'll see you there," Kris said. After Cole left, Kris sat alone in the darkness, hoping against hope that he'd made the right choice. December 3rd, 1887. The Silver Dollar Saloon was packed that Saturday night. Miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and drifters filled every table. The piano player was earning his keep, and the air smelled of tobacco, sweat, and spilled beer. Kris arrived at 9 o'clock, took his usual seat at the corner table, and ordered his usual whiskey. Within minutes, a poker game had formed. 5 players, including the town doctor and a railroad surveyor, passing through. Kris played his cards mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He'd positioned himself so his back was to the entrance, vulnerable, exactly as Cole would expect on a normal Saturday night. At 10:30, Cole Mackenzie walked through the swinging door. Kris didn't turn around, but he saw Cole's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. Cole's face was pale, his jaw set. He ordered a drink, downed it quickly, ordered another. Kris knew what was happening. Cole was building up his courage, steeling himself for what came next. At 10:42, Cole made his move. He walked across the saloon floor, hand reaching inside his coat. The bartender saw the motion and froze, recognizing what was about to happen, but too terrified to intervene. Cole came up behind Kris's chair, close enough to whisper, close enough for a point-blank shot that couldn't miss. He drew his Colt .45. In one fluid motion, he aimed at Kris's back and pulled the trigger. The sound seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. The piano stopped. Conversations died. 50 people turned to look at the deputy standing there with a gun that should have fired but didn't. Kris laid down his card, full house, aces over kings, and spoke without turning around. "I've been counting on you." Those 5 words hit Cole like a physical blow, because in that instant, everything became clear. Kris had known. He'd known everything. The approach from Sutton, the $20,000 plan, all of it. And instead of confronting Cole, instead of having him arrested or killed, Kris had let him walk into this saloon and pull that trigger. Let him expose himself in front of 50 witnesses. Let him face exactly what he'd become. Cole's gun fell from his numb fingers and clattered on the floor. His legs buckled. He dropped to his knees, gasping like a drowning man. "I'm sorry," Cole choked out. "God, Kris, I'm sorry. My brother, kid, I didn't know what else to do." Kris finally turned around in his chair. His gray eyes held no anger, only a deep sadness. "I know about Margaret and the children," Kris said quietly, but his voice carried through the silent room. "I've known for weeks. You think I'd let Thomas's family go hungry?" He reached into his jacket, slowly, so no one would panic, and pulled out an envelope. He dropped it on the poker table. "Deed to a house in Laramie, paid in full. There's also a bank account set up in Margaret's name. $5,000, more than enough to get her and the kids back on their feet." Cole stared at the envelope, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to know," Kris said simply. "I needed to know if you'd choose Carson's blood money over your honor. If you'd choose their $20,000 over 7 years of friendship and everything we've built together." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now I know." Kris stood up from the poker table. He wasn't a tall man, maybe 5'10" in his boots, but in that moment he seemed to fill the entire room. "Cole Mackenzie," Kris said, his voice formal now, "you're done as my deputy. You're going to take off that badge, walk out of this saloon, and ride straight to Laramie. You're going to help Margaret and those kids settle into their new home. You're going to find honest work. I've already spoken to the railroad company. They'll hire you as a security supervisor." Cole nodded, unable to speak. "And Cole," Kris's voice dropped lower, "when the Carsons ask you what happened here tonight, you tell them exactly what you saw. You tell them I knew about their plan from the start. You tell them I'm always watching, always listening, always 3 steps ahead. And you tell them that if they ever try something like this again, I won't show them the mercy I showed you." Cole stood on shaking legs. He unpinned his deputy's badge with trembling fingers and set it on the bar. Then he walked out of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a broken man who'd been given an impossible gift, second chance. The message after Cole left, Kris turned to face the room full of stunned witnesses. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the saloon. "The Carson brothers think they can buy anyone. They think because they have money and land, they own this territory. They think they can hire lawyers and gunmen and make all their problems disappear." He picked up his whiskey glass. "They're wrong. This territory isn't for sale. Its people aren't for sale. And anyone who thinks they can walk in here and corrupt good men with blood money is going to learn what Cole Mackenzie just learned. Some things can't be bought." Kris raised his glass. "To Wyoming territory, and to the men and women who have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them everything." 50 people raised their glasses. "To Wyoming!" The piano player started up again. Conversations resumed. The poker game continued. Within minutes, it was as if nothing had happened, except everything had happened. The aftermath, word of that night spread through Wyoming and beyond like wildfire. By morning, every cattle baron and railroad executive from Montana to Colorado had heard the story. Kris Kristofferson had known about the assassination plot for weeks. He'd let it play out. He'd made a traitor reveal himself in front of 50 witnesses, and he'd done it all without firing a single shot or breaking a single law. The Carson brothers held an emergency meeting at their ranch the next day. Marcus Carson was livid. $20,000. We paid Mackenzie $20,000, and he walks away with nothing to show for it. We didn't pay him anything, James pointed out. We offered. He took the offer to Kristofferson instead of taking the shot. You're missing the point, Nathaniel said quietly. He was standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered rangeland. We can't beat this man. We've tried everything. Force, bribery, legal manipulation. Every time we move against him, he's already seen it coming. He's playing a different game than us. But what do you suggest? Marcus demanded. We just let him win? I suggest we leave Sweetwater County alone, Nathaniel said. We focus on expanding into Montana or Colorado. But this territory, this marshal, trying to take him down is going to cost us more money and more reputation than it's worth. It was the first time the Carson Cattle Company had ever backed down from a fight, but they had no choice. Kris Kristofferson had proven something that night at the Silver Dollar Saloon. He wasn't just a lawman. He was a strategist who saw moves before his opponents even knew they were playing. The story of Cole Mackenzie's betrayal became legend in Wyoming. People told it for decades, passed it down to their children and grandchildren. It became more than just a story. It became a lesson about loyalty, about justice, and about what real power looks like. Cole Mackenzie never returned to Sweetwater County. He settled in Laramie with Margaret and the kids, worked for the railroad, and lived quietly until his death in 1912. People said he was never quite the same after that December night, that he carried the weight of what he'd almost done for the rest of his life. But he also made sure Thomas's children grew up safe, educated, and loved, and perhaps that was his redemption. Kris Kristofferson continued as Marshal of Sweetwater County for another 15 years. He never married, never sought wealth or fame. He just did his job, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, standing up to powerful men who thought the law didn't apply to them. He died in 1902, not from a gunshot, but peacefully in his sleep at the age of 63. They buried him in the Sweetwater County Cemetery, and more than 300 people attended his funeral. Ranchers and homesteaders, miners and shopkeepers, people whose lives he'd touched in ways large and small. On his headstone, they carved 5 words that summed up everything he'd been. He was counting on us. Because that's what Kris Kristofferson understood that most people miss. The most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun. It was knowing what was coming before your enemy did. It was turning their plan into your victory. It was believing in people even when they'd stopped believing in themselves. Cole Mackenzie took $20,000 in promises from the Carson brothers and walked away with nothing but shame. But Kris Kristofferson went back to his poker game, finished his whiskey, and kept being the marshal Wyoming territory needed. The lesson. Here's the thing about that December night in 1887. It wasn't just about stopping an assassination. It was about something bigger. Kris proved that real power doesn't come from money or guns or intimidation. It comes from understanding people, from seeing the game 3 moves ahead, from having the courage to risk everything on the belief that good men will ultimately choose to do good things. He could have killed Cole the moment he learned about the plot. That would have been the easy way, safe way. But Kris understood that killing Cole would have made him just another gunman solving problems with violence. Instead, he gave Cole the chance to face who he was becoming. And in that moment, when the trigger clicked on an empty chamber, Cole had to confront the truth about himself. Not just that he'd been willing to commit murder, but that the man he was about to kill had known all along and chosen mercy over vengeance. That's a lesson that echoes through the age. In business, in politics, in everyday life, people who win aren't always the strongest or the richest. They're the ones who see further, think deeper, and understand that true power comes from knowing not just what people will do, but why they'll do it. Carson brothers had all the money and influence in Wyoming. But Kris Kristofferson had something they couldn't buy. Loyalty earned through years of standing up for what was right, and the wisdom to know that even good men can falter when faced with impossible choice. So remember that in a world that often seems dominated by those with the most money or the biggest guns, never underestimate the power of seeing what's coming, understanding human nature, and being willing to give people a chance to choose who they really are. That December night at the Silver Dollar Saloon, Kris Kristofferson didn't just save his own life, he saved Cole Mackenzie's soul. And that's the kind of victory that lasts forever.